first came to the festival in 2011 for the Canadian premiere of his feature debut, Absentia. How many of you were here for that? Only a few. Okay. How many of you have seen it since? Yes. It's a great, great film. It was my favorite film of that year's edition. And it was the one that I was pushing to every press person I was speaking with at the time. They would ask about the flagship titles that had stars and filmmakers that they were following. And I would say, yes, and there's also Absentia, and that's your priority, I promise you. And we were pushing it and pushing it. We tried to turn Absentia into Star Wars to the best way that we could, because everyone on the staff was blown away by this movie. And that film, throughout his career, all the key beats of that film, the key elements of that film, have stayed through his career. So we're talking about deeply compassionate, character-driven, slow-burn horror, made with such profound melancholia and poetry. Anytime I see a Mike Flanagan piece, be it one of the Netflix miniseries or a standalone feature or a King adaptation like Dr. Sleep, I know that at a certain point, the rug will be pulled out from under my rib cage and I will be in tears. Because his films are so astonishingly profound and moving. They're such beautiful character pieces. They almost have Cassavetes qualities to them in the way that he works with his performers and the moods that he builds. And the fact that regardless of the budget class he's working with, and regardless of how commercial the projects might be from a production end, he has endless faith in the attention span of the audience and lets the stories take the time that they need to take to properly resonate and live. And very few artists are able to do that as consistently as he has. I have so much love for what Mike has done. I feel instead of words, the best thing to do is to put on a reel edited by Eric Lavoie, who edits our tribute reels each year and is one of the most brilliantly obsessive editors that I've had the pleasure to know. This really encompasses it quite beautifully. So here we go. For the next 5 minutes, enjoy, reminisce, and feel.
Let's begin.
There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, and is dreamt of in your philosophy.
All right, then. Ghost story.
A ghost can be a lot of things. A memory, a daydream, a secret, grief, anger, guilt.
People are safe from ghouls and ghosts and the living dead in the daylight. And they're usually safe from them at night if they're with others. But a person alone in the dark. Women alone in the dark are like open doors, Jesse, and if they scream for help, who knows what might answer.
The world's a hungry place, a dark place.
Life is insane. It is madness.
I think I'm in hell, Austin. I think I died. And this is hell.
Some people, that God lets the devils and the demons do their thing. They're destined for torment with some great reward in heaven.
Who knows what people see in the moment of their solitary death?
Forever and ever and ever.
I touched her, and I felt nothing. Just nothing. And it spread everywhere in me, this nothing, until I couldn't feel anything anymore. I was just this dark, empty black hole. So it's just numb and nothing and alone.
None of you could see me. nobody could see me.
We don't end, Charlie. I know that for certain. I don't know much else, but I know that we don't end.
The boundaries which divide life from death are, at best, shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins?
See, God still has a plan, and death isn't part of it anymore. Not for all of us. We don't have to be afraid ever again.
No fear. You understand?
Rebirth, resurrection, eternal life, life that rises again. Even out of blackness, love rises again.
Forgiveness is warm, like a tear on a cheek. Think of that and of me when you stand in the rain.
It occurred to me tonight that somehow I managed to write something that somehow my mind, my brain, created this story. It had something within its pages that I didn't have in me. Faith.
When we die, we turn into stories. And every time someone tells one of those stories, it's like we're still here for them. We're all stories in the end. You are loved, and you aren't alone.
Ladies and gentlemen, the recipient of our 2024 Cheval Noir Career Achievement Award. Please give it up for the great Mike Flanagan, a true poet of the genre and a one-of-a-kind storyteller.
Hello, my God, hello everybody. No, we can bring them up. Thank you guys so much for being here. It's completely overwhelming. That was amazing to watch, and I was standing next to the editor who put that together while it was playing, and I was really overwhelmed, so I don't know what to say. Thank you all so much for being here. This is crazy. And thank you, Mitch, because you talked about that screening, 13 years ago of Absentia that kind of kicked this all off. But this is a profound honor because I truly think that Fantasia is the greatest genre festival in the world. It always has. The audiences here are unlike anywhere else. This incredible and uncynical love for the genre that you and your team and your staff and your volunteers foster, and that the audience just amplifies and trumpets every time that I'm here. And it's amazing. This is an incredible honor to me because it's from you and from you guys. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. And I guess from that we can segue into the artist talk part of this afternoon. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for the evening. Please give it up to Fangoria's own and now Rue Morgue's own Michael Gingold. I will bequeath this microphone to you, and I will exit the stage. Have a great talk.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mitch, for everything. So yes, it's kind of hard to believe. It's almost exactly 13 years ago.
Yeah.
We were seeing Absentia here. Though I actually knew you before then. You would actually send a copy of your Oculus short film to the Fangoria offices. I'm not sure how many people are aware. Oculus began as a fairly lengthy title, Oculus 3, I think?
Oculus Chapter 3, The Man with the Plan. It was a great title.
Because it was actually, you were going to do kind of a little anthology series of shorts on the subject, as I recall.
Yes, we had outlined 9 installments that were meant to be these little 20-minute shorts. And we did that one first, which was the third, where you finally got to learn the history of the mirror. But we did it first because it was the cheapest. And we never did any more.
And I was kind of aware of you, I think, even before that. If I may bring up the skeleton in your closet, the film maybe people don't know about. I think your only credit as director of photography on a little independent shot in Florida, I think.
Maryland.
Shot in Maryland called Chainsaw Sally, which had a cameo appearance by Herschel Gordon Lewis, to give you an idea of where they were at with that film. And Gunnar Hansen also. With that title, it would have to be. How did that come about? How did that was your first kind of venture into horror, I think.
You know, it really was in a lot of ways. I was an undergrad at Towson University in Maryland, and there was an actor and a filmmaker there named Mark Redfield, who was producing and starring in this movie Chainsaw Sally that was written and directed by a filmmaker named Jimmy O'Barrill. And he asked me if I would be willing to be the DP. We shot on mini DV. And I was about to move to Los Angeles at the end of that year and needed to put away as much money as I possibly could, and was excited about the idea of being a DP, even though I'd never done it. I had no idea what the hell I was doing. But I figured it's mini DV. I can't fuck it up too bad. If I can see it in the viewfinder, it's on there. And so yeah, I was the DP for this delightful movie, and I would come home covered with blood. I was picking it out of my hair and out of my ears, and I remember having to get in full scrubs sometimes because the splatter was going to be just brutal. And it's funny, Mark Redfield, who starred in that movie and produced it, is the preacher who opens the Fall of the House of USHER at the funerals and is doing the readings there. So it all comes back, you know.
Nice.
Yeah.
So where did Oculus come from? What was the initial spark behind that whole idea?
Honestly, or like I'll give you guys the honest answer.
We want nothing but honesty here.
Not the PR answer. The honest answer is I really wanted to do 1408, which is an incredible Stephen King short story and a great movie about a haunted hotel room. And I couldn't, because who the hell was I, for one thing? And they were making the movie already. They had already kind of made a deal to make that. But I loved it so much, I wanted to do that, and that's Oculus. If you replace the hotel room with a mirror, down to the long history of it. 1408 has this incredible monologue, basically, about the history of the room that was terrifying to me. And so the structure of Oculus, the short, is exactly the structure of 1408, the short story. You're told the history of the object, or of the room in the case of the story, and then a skeptical protagonist is left alone in there. And in mine, it was a true believing protagonist trying to prove the point. But I just ripped off 1408, and that's where it came from.
Well, I also found a quote from back at the time where you described the mirror as a portable overlook hotel.
Yeah, that was my pitch for the feature. Yeah.
Which is great, because you eventually did get to the overlook later on, which we'll get to.
Yeah, and the mirror is hanging in the overlook in that movie, so it's all bizarrely coming back around. Yeah.
So what's the history of the short and how it led to you deciding to create Absentia as kind of a calling card feature?
Well, I was working at a company that did cable access car commercials, and I was writing and shooting and editing those, commercials you see at 2 in the morning for local car dealers. And I would have to do one or two a day. We'd shoot it in the morning, cut it, and then it would go up to air. But they had equipment. They had cameras, they had mics, they had lights. And so I got my friends together, and we had kind of written this, these 9 ideas for the haunted mirror, and picked the one we wanted to do, and I borrowed the equipment from work. And we found a coffee shop in Venice Beach, California that had a back room that was completely white, and they used it, I think it was an artist studio. And they would let us shoot it. I bought a plastic mirror online that you can't get anymore. I'm really bummed about that because I wish I could get that thing back. But I bought this mirror, and for $1,500, we went down there and we shot the short. And we had to stop rolling whenever they made coffee, which was frequently. And we made the short and started sending it around, like to Fangoria and to film festivals, and just tried to drum up some kind of enthusiasm for it to get it going as a feature film, but that wouldn't happen for years.
And I also read that producers who were interested in doing it, just as a sign of the times, they all said, can we do this as a found footage movie?
They all wanted found footage. There were cameras in the room in the short. He's in there with the mirror, and he set up his own cameras, and they said, oh, well, there's a camera in the room. This is great, found footage. And I said, no, the whole point is what happens in the movie and what happens on the cameras don't match. And we get to play with this incredibly subjective reality as what he experiences becomes less and less potentially real. And I was like, that takes away the whole kind of teeth of the thing, because found footage is objective by definition. And so everybody passed on it.
So you did Absentia kind of as basically proof that you could handle a feature film.
Yeah, because the things they said were, can it be found footage, and can someone else please make this? And they said, well, you've never done a horror feature before. And so when it was clear, and this was years of this, when it was clear that it wasn't going to happen, it was like, all right, well, I need to take that off the board. I have to take off the you've never made a horror feature. And by then, DSLRs were a thing. They had just kind of shown up, and the Canon 5D Mark II was available, which looked great. And suddenly, we were getting these very cinematic images out of a camera that was actually affordable. And I had a dear friend who was a wedding videographer who had the camera. And I was like, well, let's use that. And we went on Kickstarter to raise money for it. We raised, I think, $27,000 to shoot Absentia. We filmed it in my apartment with a crew of 8 people. No, just available light. I think we had a ring light for 2 scenes that we used, but it always looked weird. And I lived across the street from this tunnel. And the whole point of it, I needed to do a horror feature. I didn't have any money. And I started looking around and saying, what do I have right in front of me? And the only answers I had were my friends, my friend, the wedding videographer, and this tunnel that I lived across the street from that was creepy. And I was like, how do I put those ingredients together into something that'll let me make the kind of movie I would make if I was allowed to make a movie? And so we did that in the summer of 2010, and then I went right back to work. I was editing reality TV for a living, and we shot the movie, and I went back to the cutting room and kept doing that.
Who here was at Shelby Oaks last night? Well, quite a few. It's really interesting. It's almost a full circle thing, because Absentia is also about someone dealing with a long lost loved one.
No, it's interesting because I've been reflecting a lot about kind of what drew me to Chris Stuckman's journey, that he's on as a filmmaker, and there's an enormous amount of overlap in kind of in at least how I perceive him out there kind of making stuff on his own. And I think Shelby Oaks was really cool last night because you get to see kind of the birth of a filmmaker, happened in real time at Fantasia, which is really incredible. But yeah, lot of interesting similarities, I think.
And you grew up part of your childhood on Governor's Island in New York and also in Salem, Massachusetts, both of which have their share of haunted places. So can you talk about that influence on your early work and your succeeding work as well?
Sure. I didn't live in Salem very long. I was born there, and my father was in the Coast Guard, moved around all the time. And that kind of sense of always being on the move as a child also really influenced a lot of my work. Governor's Island, I was always fascinated with Salem and with the witch trials and with the legend of it all. And as I got older, I became more and more fascinated by it. Governor's Island was a Coast Guard base just off the southern tip of Manhattan. It's full of Civil War era original buildings, including a Civil War jail that's incredible and was completely haunted as far as we knew growing up there. And I lived in a renovated Civil War fort called Fort J that had a drawbridge and a moat and an incredible place for a kid to grow up. I had a decommissioned cannon in my backyard. There's a family of stray cats that lived inside the cannon. And so we were always free to roam the island because the only people that lived there were Coast Guard families. And Manhattan was a short boat ride away, but it was a completely isolated world. And so we would leave in the morning to go to school on our bikes, and we wouldn't see our parents again until we came home for dinner. And we would come home because every night at sunset, the island would play taps and lower the flags. And that told us it was time to go home. And so we were just kids out on our own, convinced we were surrounded by ghosts and daring each other to break into these abandoned and kind of shuttered, beautiful buildings. And they ended up closing the island, and it was abandoned for a number of years before New York bought it again, and it's now a park. You can go there and see a concert. I try to go there pretty frequently whenever I'm in New York, and you can go camping there. You can't spend the night anywhere. None of the buildings really work, but last time I was there, I got to see my old apartment where we lived. And it was completely, all the paint was peeling, and it was terrifying and perfect.
And you did have one kind of horror star on Absentia, which was Doug Jones. And I remember you telling me about Doug Jones Day.
Doug Jones Day. Yeah, we reached out to Doug Jones, Guillermo del Toro's Doug Jones, the Doug Jones, and asked him to come be in Absentia for one day, for one scene. And he actually responded and said, well, I'll think about it. The script is interesting, but I need to meet the director. And I was like, oh God, oh no. And I met him for coffee in Burbank, and we talked for 3 hours at coffee. If you've ever met Dougie Jones, you know he's just the loveliest human being. And so he said he would do it. And we were this tiny little group of 8 friends with no lights and no equipment, with a Canon 5D Mark II, and Doug Jones was coming over to my apartment, which is where we were shooting. We didn't have food for him or a dressing room or anything. And his whole job was to sit in this tunnel that was soaked with urine and just sit there on the ground. And so we were up the night before just disinfecting this 10-foot patch of the tunnel, just scrubbing it. It's like, Dougie's gonna be right here. Who knows what this is? And then everything was better. It's like we were spending out of pocket to bring in food and order like real food and not just eat, Twizzlers and chips. And to try to look really professional, which looking back now, I'm like, we were adorable. And he showed up, and we had all called it Doug Jones Day. It was like, we have to be ready for Doug Jones Day. Like, it's on Doug Jones Day. No one fuck up on Doug Jones Day. And he showed up and was really amazed that we had a real Doug Jones Day. He was like, no, this really is Doug Jones Day, and I feel weird about it. And I was like, yeah, it's gonna get better. We really scrubbed out the pee. You're gonna be fine in the tunnel. And if you watch that scene of the movie, we shot that movie in something like 18 days. We did 2 takes at the most, maybe 2 or 3 setups a scene. We were racing to get that thing done, except on Dougie's scene. If you watch it, you will see the insecurity of a young filmmaker manifest in the like 25 angles that we cover him from. And we're doing like 5-6 takes of each angle, and it's like a 30-second scene. And he's sitting there after lunch, we're still at it, and now we're over here, now we're over here, now we're over here, and he's going, "You're gonna use all this?" And I'm like, "I've got you, Doug. We're professional. I'm filming a lot of angles of you because you deserve it." And he's like, "Yeah, but you're gonna have to cut every half second to use all of this stuff." And I do. When you because that was like, I'm going to use everything because Doug challenged me that I got to use it. And when you watch the scene, it's like a strobe light. I'm cutting every second to a new angle just because we could. And it's the only scene in the movie that's like that. And I watch it now and I'm like, oh, Mike, relax. He's there. He's not gonna think less of you if you don't cover him from 50 angles. But yeah, Doug Jones Day was magic. And we've remained friends since then. We've worked together a couple more times. And I always will call Dougie to see what he's up to before we do something. And he's always booked. Because he's the best. But, yeah.
So Absentia led you to Oculus and to hooking up with Intrepid Pictures, which is basically your home base for many years.
Yeah, it was the first general meeting I took after Absentia was done. I lied to my day job. I was editing a backyard improvement show for a DIY channel. And I told them I had a doctor's appointment. And I went in to pitch Trevor Macy and Mark Evans at Intrepid Pictures. And I walked in with 5 of my best ideas. And I pitched my heart out. And they all were terrible. And it didn't work. And they said, well, thanks for coming in. And I was walking out the door, and I could feel the whole thing slipping away. And it was kind of the first time I'd ever gotten into a room with a production company like this, with a feature film finished, where I thought I could really do something. And I felt like I needed to save it somehow. And so I stopped in the doorway at the end of the meeting, and I turned back, and I said, I have a short film as well about a haunted mirror that I'd love to expand into a feature. And Trevor said, no offense, but a haunted mirror doesn't sound scary. And I said, if you think of it as a portable overlook hotel, that's kind of what we're going for. And he said, oh, interesting, I'll look at that. And he watched the short, and then they got in touch a few weeks later and said, we're really interested in developing this. We could maybe hire you to do a script. It's just, how do you see the movie? Because you have cameras in the room, which means it could be done found footage. And I'm like, no, no. It could be done found footage, but he said, but I think that's a mistake for this because it's really all about objective reality versus a subjective experience. And I said, okay, yeah, that's how no found footage at all. And so that kind of kicked it all off. And then some of the ideas that they had passed on in the room, we ended up making next. I think Before I Wake was the first pitch I did that day. And back then it was called Somnia, because I was really convinced that Latin titles were going to be it. And I had Absentia and Oculus, and I was like, Insomnia. And then they changed it to Before I Wake, and I was like, oh, no more Latin. But yeah, and then I worked with Intrepid for a very long time after that.
So what was the process of taking, how many of the ideas in the feature came from these outline shorts that you had, or did you kind of start from scratch when you expanded it?
We kind of started from scratch. We expanded the short as it was, and the structure of the movie's similar enough to the short. There's a section in the middle where Karen Gillan basically performs the short film as she's kind of presenting it. But it was clear that it wouldn't just naturally expand into a feature with one character alone in a room with a mirror. We needed a lot more. And in the development process, the idea of siblings came up, which I was really interested in because siblings carry with them this huge history and subtext for days. You know, when you write friends, when you write spouses, lovers, boyfriends, girlfriends, there's still a filter. Those relationships, you know, even really intense ones, have this natural kind of distance where people have built a certain way to behave with each other. Siblings don't have that. You know, siblings dispensed with the filters long ago. And so the idea of having a brother and a sister who disagreed about the events of their childhood took this idea of objective versus subjective reality and got to apply it to objective versus subjective memory. And that blew the whole movie open. And then I'm a huge fan of John Sayles' Lone Star. It's one of my favorite films. And I was looking at how he transitions between the past and present in that movie, which is genius, by simply having it happen in shot, just panning off of an actor. There might be a subtle change in lighting, but the past just steps into the frame. And I said, if we can do something like that for the whole film and just have there be no real barrier between the present and the past, we might have something really interesting. It'll just suck for whoever has to edit it. And then I was like, I want to edit it.
So you cast in the film as the younger version of Karen's character, Annalise Basso, who wound up being in Ouija, Origin of Evil, and is in your next film, Life of Chuck. And throughout your career, you've used the same actors over and over again. Is that having that kind of consistent ensemble important to you?
Very much. We joke now that we've kind of become like an acting troupe, like a theater troupe. And when Netflix kind of came up with this marketing word, the Flaniverse, which I had feelings about. There was a text chain with this kind of group of the actors who were always there, trying to come up with a nickname for it. And I think our favorite is Flavengers. And so whenever there's a new project, I'll fire off a text to the chain and say, Flavengers Flassemble. But it's a wonderful gift in my career that we have kind of accumulated this incredible group of people. And it's not just in front of the camera. A lot of the crew as well go all the way back to the beginning. A lot of the department heads, sometimes the individual crew members, PAs who started in Oculus or on Life of Chuck in completely different capacities. And it's wonderful to kind of grow with people and to be surrounded by people who elevate whatever project we're working on and pour their artistry into it in an amazing way. And with the cast in particular, it's very exciting for me to say, what haven't I seen Carla do? What's a thing Henry's always wanted to do but nobody let him do? What can with Annalise, it's been really crazy because she was, I think, 11 when I met her on Oculus. I've worked with her 3 times, and she's older today than Karen Gillan was when we filmed Oculus. And Karen is also in the Life of Chuck with Annalise, and she and I had a real tough time with that revelation. But Jake Tremblay is in the Life of Chuck. It's my 3rd time with him. I met him when he was 6. I have actors who are now grown up who weren't when I met them, and that freaks me out. But yeah, it's one of the things I love the most about my job is that I get to do it with these people who I've grown to view as family, and I'm incredibly lucky in that regard.
So speaking of Jake Tremblay, he was in Before I Wake, which was also screened at Fantasia, in the midst of a very tumultuous history, which we won't rehash the whole horrible story of the length of time it took that film to come out.
Forever.
Yeah, but it's also a story about familial loss, and that's something that is carried through almost all of your projects. So can you go into more depth about that?
Yeah, I had a wonderful childhood, and my parents are still alive, and we get along beautifully, and my sibling Jamie and I work together and get along wonderfully. So I don't have any crazy event from my childhood that explains this, except that I'm fascinated by familial trauma, and I think a lot of that is because I view the family as kind of this fortress that is meant to be safe. And when it is not, when it's besieged from without or from within, that scares me on a very, very visceral level. There was a really shocking loss in my family right before I made Absentia. And it was a death of an uncle. And I was the nearest my parents are each the oldest of 6 children, so there's a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins, a big extended family. And I was the closest to my uncle's family when it happened. And so I was kind of sent, in. And sleeping in his house the first night, kind of wrapping my head around what was happening, I had a dream about him. And that dream is actually the scare. It was in that montage. It's in Absentia, where Morgan Brown is standing and Courtney Bell reaches up to touch him, and his head is just spinning and he's shouting, and she backs up right into him. And I had that dream, and then watched as my entire extended family wrestled with and came to terms with his death. And I look at it now, and it's like that incident informed Absentia, Oculus, Before I Wake. It's basically The Haunting of Hill House. It's right there. And I still see it. I still see it pop up. And so, yeah, I think we all know what it's like to lose people. And in a family, that has tremors and aftershocks that can last for years or decades. And so that's something that's always, it's always there. I don't know why. I don't know when it started, other than that some part of me is always thinking about it. And because it forces those questions of what happens when we die. Where do we go? What's left behind of us when we die? What happened? The only thing, I think Keanu Reeves said it famously when someone said, what happens when we die? And without missing a beat, he said, the people that loved us miss us. And that's the only thing that I can say is verifiably true that I've heard for all the theories about what happens when we die. And so, yeah, it calls to mind the most fundamental questions, and the desire to be reunited with the people we love on the other side of life or death or trauma. I don't know, it's kind of everything. And so, yeah, it sure does show up, doesn't it?
And also, it has a theme that has appeared in some of your other work with Kate Bosworth's character, who does the wrong things for what appear to her to be the right reasons. And that's something that I see in other of your work as well.
I think we human beings are just so beautifully flawed things. And I like to hope that the biggest mistakes that I've made in my life, at least my intentions were good. They weren't always, but that's what I like to believe. And so characters who do the wrong thing for reasons that I understand breed an enormous amount of empathy with me. And those are the people who I want to see in a story. I have a difficult time with characters who are perfect or who are kind of above the trappings that I feel in life, or the complications of it. And I also have a difficult time with characters who are without empathy. I think we as humans are just way more complicated than that. And sure, there are examples of us that seem to be without those things. And they terrify me. And every now and then I'll write a character like that. The closest I've come to a character who just terrified me was Beverly Keene in Midnight Mass. And she scared the shit out of me. And was played by one of my dearest friends, who's one of the sweetest, most humanistic, beautiful people I've ever met, who's nothing like that, and who I feel like is doomed because fans of the show cross the street to avoid her. She's great. But yeah, I'm very complicated, and trying to understand that in my life is difficult enough. I want to see that in the characters that I love.
So after all the problems with distribution on Before I Wake, it must have come as a bit of a relief to move on to Ouija, Origin of Evil, which is Blumhouse and Universal, and you knew that was going to be out there.
Oh yeah, that was going out, yeah.
And also, you did not have a terribly tough act to follow doing that sequel.
Oh,
so.
No. And that's one of my favorite experiences in my career, because making a sequel to a movie like Ouija, I could do whatever I wanted. Like I had one job, and it was really just the last scene of the movie had to dovetail into this one detail. Unfortunately, that was a dead child. We knew that the ghost of the first movie was a little girl with her lips sewn shut. So we had to end with poor Lulu Wilson dying horribly. That was the only thing we had to do. And but other than that, it was this playground where the first one had done so well in the box office. It was a hit. The first Ouija movie did better than any movie I have ever worked on to this day at the box office. And so I had, coming off of Before I Wake, where the movie was in limbo and had been put up for theatrical release and then taken off the schedule like 3 times, all because this was back when Relativity, our distributor, was declaring bankruptcy, and we were caught up in that. And it never came out theatrically. The only public screening we ever had of that movie was at Fantasia, and it was incredible. It was a great screening. But after that, the idea of being able to go, yep, I'm going to tell a story that's absolutely going to be in theaters was really irresistible. And the fact that I got to do it with Annalise, and that was the first time I worked with Henry Thomas, it was so fun to make that movie. And every day I felt like we were just getting away with murder. We took a franchise that was about teenagers being killed by a board game, and we're telling the story of a single mom in the 60s who was a fraudulent medium. And it was like, how are we doing this? How is this Ouija 2, you know? But I love that movie so much, and I had such a wonderful experience with Blumhouse and with Universal, and when the movie came out, I was incredibly proud of it. And it didn't do nearly as well as the first one. So,
which is very sad, because it's far superior to the first one.
Well, it depends on how you look at it, I guess. Yeah.
And you mentioned it's set in the 60s, and I read that when you made it, you did not want to use any equipment that was not available at that time. You wanted to make it completely retro, and in fact, it was shot digitally, though, I believe?
It was.
And yet you have cigarette burns, little reel change markers on the upper corners.
You can hear our fake optical track warp and get distorted just before the reel changes, of which there are none. There's dust on the print just before the changes, as though it's been through the projector a few hundred times. It jumps the gate a few times in the movie. I wanted it to feel like the movies that I saw theatrically that made me interested in horror. I wanted it to be a gateway movie for younger viewers to find the kind of horror movies that I loved growing up, like Poltergeist or The Changeling. You know, I wanted it to feel like that. And Blumhouse and Universal were like, sure. And I would say, like, no Steadicam, we're just doing, we're only doing zooms. And I want to use antique lenses so that the optical qualities are distinct and interesting. And we shot it anamorphic, but then cropped it to 1:8:5, which was just mental. But it was so fun. And I still have an enormous amount of affection for that shoot. That was probably the most fun shoot I've ever had.
And then at some point during that whole process, you did Hush, which is a very atypical film for you. It's not about a family. It's not about the supernatural. It's a simple, but narratively simple, but thematically kind of complex stalker film.
Hush came out of a dinner date I had with Kate. And we shot it, if I remember right, we shot it right before Ouija, too.
Oh, okay.
But we didn't tell anyone we were shooting it. Because she and I were dating, we were out at a restaurant, we were putting, I think, away quite a bit of wine. And she was saying, I've always wanted to play a part where I get to limit the performance. I get to kind of tie one hand behind my back. And I said, well, I've always wanted to do something where, 'cause even at this point in my career, people were like, boy, those are talky, And I was like, well, I've always wanted to do something without dialogue and just do pure visual storytelling. And I was talking about Brian Henson's brilliant episode of Nightmares and Dreamscapes called Battleground, which he does without a word of dialogue, and it's incredible. And this
another Stephen King story.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't seen it, you can check it out on YouTube. It's awesome. But I was talking about that, and I was talking about an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer that I adore. Also with Dougie Jones. It all comes around.
And also called Hush.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we were going to call the movie Silence, but Scorsese had the title. Oh. And so we had to call it Hush. And Kate was talking about Wait Until Dark. And that's where that came from. But the pitch of Kate and I want to write a movie together as a relatively new romantic couple that I'll direct and she'll star in. And her only credit at that point was Mirror-Eyed Ghost in Oculus. We went to Blumhouse and to Intrepid and said we want to do this movie, and they were like, okay, it sounds cool, but with Kate starring, who was Kate, was their big question. They would only give us $1 million to do it. And they said, this could fall apart very fast. You guys could break up, for one thing, just from the pressures of the production. What happens if you stop talking to each other and we're on the hook for this movie? Or if it just doesn't work? What if it's just not good? And so we were given just enough kind of money to make it, but we didn't publicize or announce the movie. We never told anyone we were working on it. We shot it in secret. And then, fortunately, the movie worked. It's still one of my favorites. And then we just announced it. It's like, hey, we did a secret movie, and we're going to sell it. But yeah, it was a weird little thing we slipped in the middle there.
Yeah, I remember the first announcement. I think when it was announced the film was coming out, it already had a Netflix debut date, I think.
Yeah, we had taken it to, I think we premiered it at South by, and Netflix made an offer on it, and at the time it was like this weird movie with no dialogue, with kind of an unknown cast. The biggest name in the movie was John Gallagher Jr., who was just coming off of The Newsroom for HBO. And Blum, I remember saying, like, no, I think Netflix is where this lands. I don't know that this works theatrically right now. And then Don't Breathe hit theatrically. And I was like, damn it. It does work. But yeah, and Netflix scooped it up real fast, and it did very well on Netflix, and was there for 7 years. We just got it back last year.
Yeah, you just announced a digital release for later this summer, and lots of other stuff going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Netflix also rescued Before I Wake. It eventually wound up there.
Yeah, that had been all of the international territories that had bought it didn't know what to do because it was all hung on this big 3,000 screen domestic, theatrical release it was supposed to have. That fell apart, and they didn't know what to do because Relativity was spiraling, and they weren't kind of being forthcoming right away about the bankruptcy. And so they just started releasing it in other territories, and it was immediately pirated. And then just hit the torrent sites, which basically obliterated our domestic distribution viability after Relativity kind of went away. And so Netflix absolutely saved that movie. By then it was 3 years after it was supposed to have come out. Everyone had kind of written it off and said, oh, that's probably terrible. That's probably a terrible movie. And the only reviews that were available were ones from international releases that had been really kind of unceremoniously dumped out there. And so our Rotten Tomatoes score wasn't great, and it was a really tough thing to try to sell after Relativity finally said we're not putting this out at all. And Netflix scooped it up, and it just kind of, we had this one gorgeous screening here, and then it just appeared on Netflix and vanished. It's still there, you can see it, it's there, but I don't think most people have seen that movie.
And then Netflix backed Gerald's Game.
Yes, so after, this was kind of, Netflix was really happy with us at this point because between Before I Wake and Hush, which had done great, we had taken Gerald's Game out. Stephen King had given us the rights to Gerald's Game after he saw and loved Oculus, which was a life-changing moment for me. He just tweeted it, and I saw it, and I freaked out. And he had given us the rights. We had taken my script for Gerald's Game all over town. Everybody passed. No one wanted to make the movie. And we lost the rights. Because you have a window to get it set up, and if everyone says no, Stephen King very reasonably wants to take it back and see if someone else can get it made later. And so we'd lost it. And Netflix, after Hush, came back and said, hey, what else do you have that you're into? And we showed them Gerald's Game, and they said, we'd take a flyer on that. That sounds great. Nobody else would touch it. And we went back to King, and at this point, I'd still never spoken to him or met him or anything. I just saw his tweet. and we had gotten the rights through the agents and everything. And said, can we have them back? Because Netflix will make the movie. And then we got into that, which at the time was the most daunting and kind of terrifying production experience I could imagine, and a great practice for the nausea that was to follow. So, yeah.
Well, it was always considered an unfilmable book because it's so interior. It's one character in a house for almost the entire duration of it. On a personal note, though, I have to say, when I read that book, and I was thinking, oh, could this be a movie? You have the character of Raymond Joubert, I think is how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, if they made a movie, they should get Carol Stryken to play that part.
Yeah.
I thought that when I read that book, and years later, Carol Stryken plays that part in your film.
And he's amazing.
Yeah, he's great. He's perfect for it.
We worked together again after that on Dr. Sleep, because he's just one of my favorite humans. Gerald's Game, I mean, the book kind of is unfilmable. And I read it when I was 19 years old and put it down, kind of like goose flesh on my arms, I remember, when I put the book down. I was so impressed with it. And I remember thinking, it's impossible to be a movie. They'll never make a movie out of this. And I spent years thinking, but if they did, what would it look like? Like, what's the coolest version of it? And I used to carry it around in my early meetings as a dream project, and I would bring it up at general meetings. And either they'd read the book, and if they had, they would say, they can't make a movie out of that. Or they hadn't read the book, in which case they go, that sounds really interesting, let's look into it. And the next day they go, no, you can't make a movie out of that. But I had a pretty cool idea, I thought, for how to do it. Hush is testing it. There's a scene in Hush where Kate imagines herself getting killed. And then there's this whole thing where she games out all these different possibilities, and there's another version of her kind of sitting next to her and talking her through it. That is a test, a proof of concept for Gerald's Game. And the script already existed when we were shooting that. And that was kind of the thing where people were like, that doesn't work. How is that interesting? It's visually confusing. Might take the audience out of the movie. And Hush was our chance to go, here's what it looks like. We did it for one scene, and it worked. And it was like, that's the movie. That's Gerald's Game. Imagine that for an hour. And because Netflix was so happy with Hush, they said, no, we get it. We get that. And we got to make that movie. That's how I met Carla Gugino, who also became one of the kind of centerpiece collaborators of our little group. And Carla and Bruce Greenwood and Henry Thomas and Kate, pregnant with our son in that movie, came down to Alabama, where we'd shot Oculus, Before I Wake, and Hush. And we filmed Gerald's Game in the Convention Center, Mobile, Alabama. Yeah.
And so Stephen King was a very formative influence on you from an early age. I read somewhere you did like a 20-minute version of It when you were very young.
Yeah, we had no permission for that. Yeah, it was a VHS movie I made in like 5th grade with my friends. We had a clown mask and we did It.
Will we ever see that as a bonus feature on any of your...
I have been desperately trying to find it. I found a VHS movie. I did my version of De Palma's Untouchables in like 5th grade. I play Elliot Ness. I'm terrible. But I found that. And recently digitized it off the VHS, and it's a trip, but I cannot find it. And I think if I did, I couldn't put it out there anyway, because I imagine that's a huge copyright violation. So,
it's too bad. And so then, of course, he went on to Dr. Sleep, marvelous film. I'm a huge fan of that. I think it's one of your very best films. And though you had a couple of small stumbling blocks, because you're following up Stephen King's novel, the sequel to his novel, The Shining. And in the novel, Dick Halloran is still standing and the Overlook is not. In the feature of The Shining, it's the opposite.
Right.
And so how did you kind of deal with, you need to kind of make a sequel to both Stephen's novel and Kubrick's film at the same time?
That question was what kept me up at night and made me feel nauseous for 2 years. And I read Dr. Sleep. I loved the book. But every image in my mind as I read it was Kubrick's, because The Shining is such a seminal and influential piece of work on me. And so it was really a strange tug of war that was happening, where, especially at the beginning of Dr. Sleep, when he revisits Danny as a child and Wendy, and there's a scene where Dick Halloran comes to visit them in Florida, very much alive, and they have a conversation on the bench. And the problem was I was seeing Shelley Duvall, I was seeing Scatman Carruthers, I was seeing Danny Lloyd. Stephen King was seeing it very differently. He was actively trying to stay away from everything about Kubrick's adaptation. And throughout the entire book, I felt that tug of war. And I was in love with the story of Dan Torrance as an adult, with his journey to and through sobriety, with The True Knot and Rose the Hat, who I thought was one of the most effective King antagonists I'd seen in a long time. But I kept finding these speed bumps reading it because I was like, all the visual language of this universe is Kubrick's language. That's just the way it is. And at the end of the book, the final confrontation happens on the site that used to be the Overlook, but because King was emphatic that Jack Torrance had sacrificed himself and burned it down, it's gone. And it was this empty field with like picnic tables and porta potties. And I was like, but if that was in the hotel, that would be amazing. Like, that would be it. And so that was kind of my whole pitch, was I want to adapt Dr. Sleep, but I want to use Kubrick's visual language and make it a direct sequel to his film. And they said, how do you reconcile it? And I said, I have no fucking idea. And we have to kind of decide scene by scene. And, it seems really easy now, but it's like, oh yeah, well, the scene with Dick Halloran and Danny on the bench plays exactly as it does in the book. It's just that when Wendy arrives, all she can see is Danny, because Dick is dead. And it's like, oh, well, I can keep the heart of the scene and be true to the book, and I'm just changing one detail that makes it work in Kubrick's canon. Let's try to do that in every possible scene. And then the ending obviously had to be changed, and I knew that Steve would be upset about that, especially given his feelings about how the ending of The Shining was changed by Kubrick. But my pitch was, what if I give you that ending back, the one that was taken away? And I'll change the ending of Dr. Sleep, but I'm going to give Danny Jack's ending from the book. And then the thing that Steve was the most upset about losing when The Shining was made, what if we bring it back and Danny can fulfill his father's legacy? And he really liked that idea. And so I knew I was going to piss off everybody. That the King fans had plenty to be mad about, and the Kubrick fans had plenty to be mad about, but as someone who felt kind of like the child of both of those parents, I was like, it's an awesome parent trap, we can try to pull them back together. It was an amazing moment because I had so much fun making the film. I loved the film. I was sick to my stomach every day. I was really terrified of it. I got sober making the film. Like the film changed me just working on it. It's a film about sobriety. It's a book about sobriety, and I came through the other side of it sober because of it. And that was an amazing, incredible thing for me. Thank you. And when it finally was done, I sent it to. I watched it with Stephen King. I went to Bangor and I sat with him in an empty theater, right next to him, which must have been really uncomfortable for him too. Nothing but empty seats, and I'm there like. I didn't see the film at all. I was staring at him the whole time. And every reaction he had, I was like, oh shit. Oh no. Oh yeah. No. Oh no. And the film ended, and he leaned over and he said, "You did a beautiful job." And I just kind of shat myself. And then he said, "But the baseball boy scene is too much." And I was like, "Oh, no problem. We'll cut that back. We'll cut that back." And then we sent the film off to Kubrick's estate, and I was like, "Oh no, Steve liked it, so they're going to hate it." And they came back and they said, "We think it's great." And we think it really honors Stanley's work. And I said, oh my God, this is amazing. The Parent Trap worked. And then I said, it doesn't matter what happens from here. The film could crash and burn. The important thing is that this happened. and then it bombed. So I won. Yeah. Yeah.
So you've obviously explored many worlds of horror literature since then with the series that you've done. So can you talk about the process of turning basically very short novels or short stories into lengthy series, and also, again, with A Haunting of Hill House and Haunting of Bly Manor, you're kind of, in a sense, doing remakes of classic horror films.
Well, I mean, The Haunting of Hill House was an interesting case because that was brought to me. I was called into Amblin, who controlled the material, and they said, hey, we'd love to do The Haunting of Hill House for television. How would you do that? And I believed that The Haunting of Hill House had been perfectly adapted by Robert Wise in 1963. It's a perfect movie. And I said, well, the novel as it stands works for about 90 minutes. So if you're talking about a TV show, you need to do a radical expansion. And you need to do something different because it was adapted perfectly in 63. It was then adapted again in 99 by Jan de Bont, throwing every kind of available piece of technology at the time at it, to, we'll say, mixed results. And I said, there's no point in trying to do a straight adaptation better than Wise did, and we have to fill 10 hours. And so I did Oculus. The Haunting of Hill House is Oculus. Instead of 2 siblings, there are 5. 2 timelines braided together, same technique for cutting back and forth between them. It's all about family trauma and a disagreement about a traumatic event in their childhood, while they're forced to reconfront that traumatic event in the present. It's just Oculus. But it's Oculus for 10 hours. And that meant that I got to really dig into the characters. And for that was an enormous amount of drawing from my own family. And to the point that I had to contact several of them and make sure that we were okay to get into some of the things that show gets into. It was my first time doing television. I knew we were I looked at it as a remix. I was like, we're not really adapting Shirley Jackson's book. We're taking all the pieces that exist there and trying to build something new that honors her and honors, one of the greatest horror novels ever written. And it was the same feeling I had with, Dr. Sleeper. I'm like, we're going to piss people off. But as someone who loves Shirley Jackson, I'm going to do my best. If I feel like it's the kind of thing I would have liked to see, then hopefully there'll be a number of people that feel the same way. I also believed it could end my television career. I don't know why they let me do it. I don't understand it to this day. They were greenlighting a lot more shows back then. And Netflix, who was happy with me for all the movies, said, sure. But I wasn't qualified to do it. I'd never been in a writer's room. I'd never worked on a television show before. I was now show running. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what the job was. I was like, is that like just directing for longer? He said, not at all. I said, oh, good. And so I had to figure it out. And I said stupid stuff when I was pitching it. I said, I want to direct all 10. I said, wouldn't it be neat if we did an episode that looked like it was done in one shot? I think what I said at the time was, wouldn't it be neat if we really did an episode in one shot?
Well, you almost got there with 2 storms, which is brilliant.
Got there. It's
that was
5
fantastic.
shots.
Yeah.
But we almost got there. It turns out that's really fucking hard and really expensive. And so I didn't know that. And so I was saying all this stuff in the room, like, yeah, we'll do an episode that's all one shot. I'm directing all of it. It's my thesis on ghost stories. Piece of cake. And it turned out to be the most difficult job I've ever had. And there's pictures floating around of me out there somewhere from the end of the shoot. I lost so much weight making that. I was so stressed out. It was the hardest, most punishing experience of my life. And kind of coming off of Ouija 2, where it's like, yay, I get to go to work and do this. Doing The Haunting it was a 100-day shoot. by halfway through, I was like, how are we going to do this? Because I was directing every episode, and Mike Flanagan, who'd been my DP since Oculus, was shooting every episode, we could never go prep because we were on set. And so we worked without a single day off for 6.5 months. Because if we weren't on set shooting, we were in the office shot listing, prepping, location scouting, trying to stay a week ahead of the show. And it almost killed us both. And I remember when the show was finished thinking that my career in television was over. And that it was a tough shoot for everybody. 3 studios involved. There was I learned so much about kind of studio politics and just what it takes to really get a show going. I remember vividly the period of time when suddenly someone said, what if we don't do the single take episode and just kill that idea? And fighting so hard to keep it, even knowing that I didn't know that we could do it. And then the show came out and was the most successful thing that I'd ever been a part of at that point in my career. And suddenly threw me back into television in a big way. When they wanted to do, it was a big hit, they wanted another one. We'd made that impossible by the way we ended the thing, because you never know if you're going to get a second season. And I was like, this is a contained story. And we came up with the idea of we'll do what Ryan Murphy's doing, and we'll anthologize this. We'll use the cast and we'll tell a different story. And the idea came up for The Turn of the Screw, because we were talking about what are the seminal classic horror literature titles out there that could work. The Turn of the Screw has been adapted so many times. And I think Jack Clayton's The Innocents in '61 is the best for me. And it's like, we're not going to top that. It was the same thing with the Bob Wise movie. And it was like, all right, well, let's break it into pieces. And let's now pull in all the thing we had with Shirley Jackson, we only had one book. With The Haunting of Bly Manor, we had the entire library that we could pull from. And so it was like, let's pull in all the books. Let's really try to make something that's completely its own thing and not step into the shadow of dozens of other adaptations of this one story. Let's do something else. And then that did better than Hill House. But that one I only directed one. I was so exhausted, and looking at the prospect of a longer-term career in television and seeing the toll that Hill House had taken on my body and my psyche and my family and everything else. I was like, no, I'll do one. I was in the writer's room supervising everything and pulling together all the Henry James titles and doing all that. But I just shot the pilot and then was working on Midnight Mass and still on set, but functioning like a real showrunner and bringing in other directors and really kind of starting to dive into the true collaboration of television, which was new for me. And I loved it. And it's funny how you forget, because the next thing I said was I wanted to direct all of Midnight Mass. And Kate said, oh, Jesus. But, Kate had a pretty phenomenal role to play in that, and I asked, you're going to have to do some of the most difficult performing of your life. I want to be there for all of it. And it was only 7 episodes, and we weren't doing one in one shot. We just did one long shot in episode 2, but it was like 8 minutes. It was nothing. And so Midnight Mass became kind of my return to that kind of TV, and it was cyclical. That one was an incredible experience. It's still my favorite of the shows I've ever gotten to do. It was completely consuming, and right after that we did the Midnight Club, and I think I did 2 of those. And it was weird. It was like I had these projects where I'd throw myself completely in, and then these others where I was really there to facilitate other storytellers. And then we ended it with House of USHER, where this was really neat. I got to split. It was 8 episodes. I did 4, and Mike Flanagan, my DP since Oculus, directed the other 4. And we were together all day, every day. And if he was directing, I was still there. And if I was directing, he was my DP. I was not his DP. He didn't ask me to.
He didn't see Chainsaw
He didn't see
Sally and
Chainsaw
say,
Sally, I
need you
guess.
for...
But I was like, now you're DP. And he was like, no, I'm good. But that was really lovely. And he's like my brother at this point. We've my whole career I've been sitting next to him basically and at the monitor. And so we got to do that together. And that kind of closed out the Netflix TV era. And we moved our company. Yeah.
And now you're back doing features with, what can you tell us about Life of Chuck at this point?
So Life of Chuck is my favorite of the movies, by a mile. It's my favorite one. I love it so much. It's important to say it's not a horror film. I think it's based on the Stephen King story, and I'm doing it, so people are like, horror, which I get, but it's not. And we're having the world premiere at TIFF in September. Which should be crazy. The film was made completely independently, which is also new for me. It's been a number of years since I did that, which was awesome. And we shot it in Alabama with a lot of the crew from Oculus, which was really special. But it's Tom Hiddleston, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Karen Gillan, Mark Hamill. It's just wonderful. I love this movie so much. And I can't wait for people to see it. But yeah, it's not scary at all. So don't be mad if you want a horror movie. But we're hoping to sell it at the festival. I hope someone buys it. We'll see what happens. Yeah.
And of course, we have to talk about the next big one. You're taking over The Exorcist.
Yeah. Be gentle, yeah.
So what can you tell us about your plans for that?
Only that I haven't felt nauseous like this since Dr. Sleep. I can't talk about the specifics except that we're doing something entirely new with it. Radically new. The Exorcist is a monolithic achievement in cinema. And it's a brilliant and perfect film. It is pointless to remake it. It is pointless to reboot it. The franchise, because it's Hollywood, it was franchised, has been just beleaguered. And I think Exorcist 3 is a fucking great movie. Outside of the first one, that movie, that's it for me. I love that movie. But in a sense, I'm stepping into a project that has a huge mountain behind it. The shadow could completely consume me, and the mountain could fall and squish me like a bug. All of that could happen. But I'm coming into a franchise on, we're the 7th installment, where it's like, yeah, there's room to do something great. There's room for improvement within the franchise, not to the first picture. I think probably not to the third picture, but there's room in there. And so we're doing something totally wild and new, and I'm incredibly excited about it. I would be excited about it if it wasn't called The Exorcist, But yeah, I'm very appropriately terrified of it, and it's keeping me up at night already. But we have a release date already. We don't have a script yet, but I'm working on it on the flight out of here. We'll eventually be on set, I assume, because it comes out March 13th, 2026, Friday the 13th. And big wide universal release. So it's gonna be crazy. I really hope you come check it out at the theaters. And I hope you're not mad. It's gonna be
I don't think we will be. I have to ask, Alex Esso is one of your recurring actors,
Yeah.
and she was in The Pope's Exorcist. You got to give her a part in the real thing now.
I'm told that you can't make an Exorcist movie without Russell Crowe anymore. And Alex worked with him, beautifully in that. But yeah, of course, Alex. I saw her in Starry Eyes and thought she was incredible, and that's why we cast her as Wendy Torrance in Dr. Sleep, and her Shelley Duvall performance. creepy how incredible it is. But I've worked with her a few times now. She's one of my favorites to have on set, and I would love to have her on this. We haven't yet kind of talked to the Flavengers about who's going to be there. I have to finish the script, and I've learned the hard way not to say to an actor, this is what I think you're doing or not doing early, because there are all these other factors, and the script could change, the characters can change. The studio might have opinions about who they'd like cast in their giant movie. I imagine the Flavengers conversation will happen very late, but there absolutely will be a lot of familiar faces. I'm sure there'll be some new ones too. So, yeah.
I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience, if anyone has anything. Right there.
Hi.
I feel like my question is usually reserved for actors. Such a view of his characters, and you live with them just like acting does. Only because it's going to portray the character. But I was wondering, do you have a character that still haunts you, that they're still even carrying with you, that you still think about?
Yeah, the question, if you don't hear it in the back, is there a character that still haunts me and that I still kind of think about? There are a few. Riley in Midnight Mass is a very thinly veiled avatar of myself. And I didn't know how thin the veil was until the show was done, and I was like, oh shit. But Riley, in a lot of ways represents a lot of my biggest fears. And the opening of the show is Riley at a car accident, realizing that he drove drunk and he killed someone, which was my biggest fear when I was drinking. And I would worry about something happening to me, but on nights when I really overdid it, and I had nights where I drove and I should not have, the fear I'd have was that I would have done something to hurt or kill someone else. And so Riley's born of that. And a lot of the conversations that are in that show are about alcoholism, about crisis of faith, about shame, about sobriety. And so Riley Flynn, for me, turned into this repository of a lot of me. And I'm uncomfortable watching it because of that. And I think Zach made the character his, but I still think about Riley. And Riley was supposed to, in the initial version of the thing, Riley was meant to make it to the end. And Aaron was the one who got, spoilers, sorry. Aaron got turned at the midpoint, and they rowed out on the boat. She rowed him out, and then he watched as she, if you've seen it, you know what happened. And at the very last minute in the writer's room, Riley, to me, was just clearly not the lead of it. And a lot of what Riley was to me over the years and kind of where a lot of that went was over. And I was sober at that point. There was a lot of Riley that I wanted to put away, and we switched it. And Riley doesn't make it out of the boat, and Aaron carries the torch for the rest of the show. And that, I kind of buried a part of myself there, and so he haunts me. I will also say I have an enormous, it's not my character, so I can't really say this, but Danny Torrance, to me, lives in my heart, and Ewan's performance of him lives in my heart. And I'm still scared of Beverly Keane. I mean it. And when I first started writing the characters, 10 years before we made the show, and I thought she was really stretching suspension of disbelief. I didn't think she was realistic. And now I think she's everywhere. And that freaks me out. But yeah, I still find her voice in my head at times, and she scares the shit out of me. Yeah.
More questions? Down here?
When you talk about your inspiration, your favorite horror movies, like The Exorcist, where you mentioned The Changeling, they all are it's horror movies, so quite depressing or bleak. But the few, I think, like you like to show also the beauty of behind all that horror. show that there's still good inside, like the end of the Haunting of Hill House, or when the ending of the one-shot episode. Well, it's supposed to be a scary image of a ghost, but it's just sad, and I have tears just thinking about it. But when you choose to show horror like that, does it have something to do with you, or I don't know if I'm explaining myself.
No. For me, beauty and horror are intertwined and can't and shouldn't be separated. Stephen King would say there's no horror without love, and that we can get as dark as we want, but it's impossible to understand it without light. I see a lot of beauty in horror because I think horror is a mirror for us as individuals and as a society, and we use it to examine the darkness, to examine the things we're afraid of, our anxieties, our prejudices, our shortcomings. And especially since I've had children, it became increasingly important to me that if they ever interrogate a story that I've told, no matter how dark it gets or how scary it gets, that there's hope at the end. I never want my kids to see a story I made and feel hopeless. And Absentia has a bleak ending. Oculus has a very bleak ending. I haven't been able to do that since, because I know that they're going to watch these things. And someday they'll watch them when I'm gone, and what I say in these stories matters. Plus, I think the world needs that. I think, boy, we're not short on darkness, you know, or stress, or anxiety, and more than ever, I feel like hope, forgiveness, and basic empathy for each other is critical. And horror as a genre breeds empathy more immediately than almost any other, you know. And we can talk about serious things. If you want to make a drama about racism in America, you can, and you will get a great audience for that. But it'll be a smaller one, and they'll either come into it knowing that they agree with you or that they don't. But if you make Night of the Living Dead, you get this huge audience that wants to see a scary movie about zombies, and then at the end, you talk about race, you know, and it's profound. And you've now had this conversation with a much bigger audience that's more receptive to it, because you also gave them this really cool, thrilling experience along the way. It's the power of the genre, and horror is discounted in a lot of academic circles, and even within the industry, as somehow being less relevant or less impactful than the other genres, which is total horseshit. It's remarkably, uniquely positioned to talk about very serious things and to bring incredible messages and stories into the hearts of a fan base that's more enthusiastic than any other genre. For me, I need to have beauty and hope as part of that. One of the things I'm excited about with The Life of Chuck is it's the first project I've ever made in my life that doesn't have 1 ounce of cynicism. And we were trying, my friends and I were talking about this while we were here, about what are the other movies that don't have any cynicism to them. And we're like, okay, Akiru, you know, maybe. Searching for Bobby Fischer, Rudy. You know, these movies that just kind of exist to make you joyful. And it's such a short list. And this is a movie that kind of lives in that world. And I'm like, what a joy it is to be able to do something that's that kind of purely uncynically joyful. And then to go do The Exorcist. Right after. So yeah, that's a rambling answer, but I think beauty, hope, forgiveness, love, and empathy and respect for each other, which is the thing that's dying the most, I think. That's critical, and we can still be scary, but if we can come out just a little hopeful, I think it's important.
More questions? Oh gosh, right there in the center. Yeah.
I have a small question. about the Oculus mirror. You said it was in the Overlook, but I also noticed it in Ouija, Origin of Evil in the basement, and I think I saw a glimpse of it in The Fall of House USHER.
It's in the bar, yeah.
Yeah. So, is there other movies or show where you like to place it?
Yeah, it's in Hill House when Nell is dancing through Hill House, and I think it's at 5. She's dancing with her imagined fiance. It's on the wall. There's a shot framed in the mirror. I don't think we got it into Bly. No, it was. It's in the attic. When Danny's tied up, it's in the attic. It's in the Midnight Club. It's in the secret basement of the hospice. It's in USHER. It's in Midnight Mass, and all of the scenes where Father Paul and Riley are having their AA meetings in the empty room. It's if you look at the stage, it's got a sheet covering most of it, but you see the corner of it peeking out behind them. Yeah. I love that mirror. It's really fun. And since we never got to anthologize it, really all of these are just Oculus sequels. Look at all the bad shit that happens when the mirror's there. So, yeah.
We have time for one more question, right down here.
Yeah, I was wondering, you're talking a lot about Stephen King's novels, and the last series was USHER with all the Edgar and Poe. So how did you get to work on the text of Edgar and Poe?
I've been a Poe fanatic since I was very young. And when we were talking about, it was initially kind of a conversation about The Haunting, and it was like, what are some of the classic pieces of horror literature that we could do as a season of The Haunting. And I remember there was early talks about what if we did The Haunting of the House of Usher. But Poe is it felt limiting to kind of look at it as a ghost story, because there's so much else with Poe to play with, and I felt like that needed to be its own thing. We used the same strategy we used with the Henry James work of just trying to kind of pull as much as we could and find connections, whether they were narrative or thematic, that could let us build one story that touched on so many pieces of work, and filled it with Easter eggs, which is one of my other favorite things to do. And Poe fans, it was like, oh, well, just this one name to the right Poe fan will mean something, or this date, or if they look at the address of the building, that's Poe's birthday. There was stuff like that. That was probably, that was my 5th show. And that was the one where I felt like we got the writer's room right. That was the most rewarding and exciting writer's room. And I had an incredible group of writers who loved Poe. One of them was a professor who taught Poe. So, we really stacked the deck in our favor. And that was such an electric thing where people were finding ways to connect the stories. And then the show was fun because Poe, unlike anyone else that I'd been adapting, Poe's funny. His comedy is great. And when we were reading all of the Poe work, it was like, yeah, it's dark and it's melancholic and it's really gothic and wonderful. And then he has these absurdist comedic pieces of work. And it's like, could we do something that's dark and hilarious? Can that kind of give us the flavor of Poe? The feeling we had having read everything that he had done. And so that opened up the show into a place that it felt like, it felt more fun than any of the other shows I'd gotten to do. And we got so heavy on Midnight Mass and all of them. We got the one right before it was about teenagers in a hospice. Really heavy days at work. And once we kind of cracked open Poe, it was wicked. It was like, this is just fun. And then we got to melt hundreds of people. And that was really fun to do. So, yeah.
So before we go, we want to get a photo of the crowd, I believe.
Please.
So,
Yes.
do you want Mike in front of the crowd, I guess? Yes. Okay.
You can have people cheering.
Yeah, if we get everyone cheering, applauding, going crazy with this gentleman ahead of you. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Mr. Flanagan, for the great work and for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you so much.
Thanks again.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.